The living room was warm and inviting, the gentle glow of the lamps casting soft shadows across the walls as voices mingled in pleasant conversation. I glanced around, watching as my friend moved through the room, chatting with her family members and old friends who had come over for the evening. This wasn't my usual crowd, but the cozy atmosphere had a way of making everyone feel at ease. Sighs slept, and then I noticed him. He was seated in an armchair by the window, his attention focused on the conversation between two other guests, his face creased in a soft smile. He had a presence that was hard to ignore, quiet but magnetic, a calm that seemed to center everything around him. I remembered my friend mentioning him, a family friend who had known her parents since they were young. He was 63, I recalled, though he carried himself with a youthful ease, his movements steady and assured. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and he nodded, a friendly, welcoming gesture. I returned the smile, feeling a flicker of curiosity spark within me. He looked like the kind of person who had stories to tell, who held a wealth of experiences and quiet wisdom. My friend noticed our exchange and made her way over, a smile on her face. "Have you met Robert yet?" she asked, glancing between us. "He's practically family." I shook my head, extending a hand. "Not yet. Nice to meet you, Robert." "Likewise," he replied, his grip firm but gentle, his smile warm. "I've heard a lot about you from Amelia here." I laughed softly, casting a glance at my friend. "I hope only good things." "Always," he said with a chuckle, his gaze holding mine for a moment longer than expected. There was a kindness in his eyes, a depth that made me feel comfortable, even though we'd just met. As the evening went on, I found myself drawn into conversations with him, his voice low and steady, his words thoughtful. He spoke about his work. He'd been a professor before retiring, a fact that didn't surprise me. He had that quiet, inquisitive nature that I often associated with teachers, a way of listening that made you feel heard and understood. We continued talking as the evening unfolded, our conversation drifting easily from one topic to another. Robert had a way of making even the simplest subjects feel significant, his insights layered with a sense of humor and understanding that was refreshing. I noticed the small details in how he spoke, the slight pause before he answered, the way he had placed the plates together in the simple way, the slight pause before he answered, the way he asked for privacy when he was at his desk and spoke slowly and clearly, leaving a space for me to tread the scent trails within the story. The other guests moved around us, their laughter and conversations forming a gentle backdrop as Robert and I settled into our own quiet exchange. I hadn't expected to feel so drawn to someone I'd just met, especially someone older, but there was something undeniably engaging about him. He made me feel as if my thoughts and stories were interesting, as if he genuinely wanted to know about my life, my dreams, my fears. Eventually, people began to gather their coats and say their goodbyes, their voices growing softer as the evening waned. My friend gave me a knowing smile, raising her eyebrows slightly as she watched us. I smiled back, feeling a warmth rise in my cheeks, but not pulling away from the conversation with Robert. The house gradually emptied, leaving only a few of us lingering in the dimly lit living room. Robert and I remained by the window, our voices lower now, more introspective. He leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window where the stars had begun to dot the night sky. "It's been a while since I've had a conversation like this," he said quietly, his voice carrying a hint of reflection. "Life keeps us so busy. It's nice to slow down every once in a while." I nodded, understanding completely. Yes, it feels grounding somehow, like we're able to pause and really be present. He looked over at me, his eyes soft but intent. "That's rare these days. I'm glad we had the chance." We fell into a comfortable silence, letting the weight of the moment settle between us. There was something unspoken hanging in the air, a quiet understanding that neither of us voiced, but both seemed to feel. The conversation had shifted, taking on a depth that felt as though it were pulling us closer, layer by layer. After a moment, he broke the silence, his voice softer now, as if he were choosing his words carefully. "I don't mean to pry, but you seem introspective tonight. Is there something on your mind?" I hesitated, surprised by the question. I hadn't realized how much I'd let my guard down around him, how naturally I felt like I could be honest, even vulnerable. "It's been a strange time for me," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think I've been questioning a lot about where I'm going, what I want out of life. There's this feeling of not quite fitting in my own world, if that makes sense." He nodded, his gaze holding mine with an intensity that was both comforting and disarming. "It makes perfect sense. I think a lot of people feel that way, but few are willing to admit it." There was a reassurance in his words, a feeling that he understood in a way that went beyond polite empathy. He looked at me as if he could see the parts of myself I rarely showed, the doubts and fears that lingered beneath the surface. It was a feeling I couldn't quite explain, a closeness that felt new and familiar all at once. "You know," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I went through something similar not too long ago. After I retired, there was this strange emptiness, this quiet that felt too vast. I had spent so much time being busy, defining myself by my work, that I didn't know what to do with myself once it was over." He looked away, a faint smile playing on his lips as he continued. "But over time, I found that it gave me the freedom to rediscover things I'd forgotten about myself, things that got lost along the way." His words resonated deeply, stirring something within me that I hadn't been able to put into words before. It was as if he had named a feeling I'd been carrying, an unspoken yearning for something more, something real. "Maybe that's what I'm searching for," I replied, my voice soft. "That freedom to rediscover, to feel alive in a different way." He looked back at me, his eyes warm and understanding. "You will. Sometimes it just takes finding the right person, the right moment, to remind you of who you are." The words hung between us, filled with a depth that neither of us could ignore. I felt my heart quicken, a quiet thrill that I hadn't expected, a feeling of being seen in a way I hadn't experienced in a long time. There was something undeniably intimate in that moment, a connection that was both thrilling and calming. For a few moments, we simply sat there, the silence thick with a quiet anticipation. It was as if we were both waiting, allowing the moment to unfold naturally, letting it carry us forward without the need for words. He reached out, his hand brushing lightly over mine, a gentle touch that felt like an invitation, a question unspoken. My breath caught as I looked down at our hands, his touch warm and grounding. It was a simple gesture, yet it held a weight, a quiet promise that neither of us voiced. The room felt smaller, the world outside slipping away as we were drawn into this shared moment, this quiet understanding that had grown between us. I met his gaze, feeling a surge of emotions that I couldn't quite name, a blend of curiosity, comfort, and something deeper, something that felt like the start of a new chapter. We stayed like that, hands resting together, our gazes locked, and I felt as though we were standing on the edge of something neither of us had planned for, but both felt drawn to. If I had to guess, I'd say, in that stillness, it felt as though time had slowed. each second stretching out, filled with a quiet intensity. He held my gaze, his eyes searching mine, as if he were looking for a sign, a confirmation of what we both felt, but hadn't dared to speak aloud. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't want to presume, but there's something here, isn't there? I nodded, my heart racing, my voice catching as I replied, Yes, I think there is. He let out a slow breath, his expression one of both relief and quiet joy. It's been a long time since I've felt this way. I didn't expect to. Especially not tonight. I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me, a feeling of being understood, of being connected to someone in a way that felt both profound and gentle. Neither did I, but I'm glad it happened. His hand tightened slightly around mine, and for a moment, we simply sat there, letting the quiet understanding settle between us. The world outside seemed distant, as though it existed in a different time, a different place. All that mattered was this moment, this feeling that had grown quietly between us. We talked for a while longer, our words soft, our voices barely above a whisper. There was a comfort in his presence, a feeling of being able to let down my guard, to let myself be vulnerable without fear. And as the evening wore on, I realized that this connection, this bond we'd formed, was something rare, something that didn't come around often. Eventually, I felt a sense of calm settle over me, a quiet joy that filled the spaces where doubt and uncertainty had once been. It was as if he had reminded me of something I'd forgotten, something essential and real. As we shared one last look, one last quiet moment, I felt a sense of gratitude, a feeling of having been given a gift I hadn't expected. It was a feeling I knew would stay with me, a memory that would linger, reminding me of a night filled with quiet conversations, gentle touches, and the warmth of a connection that felt both surprising and deeply right. With a soft smile, he gave my hand one last squeeze, his eyes holding mine as he whispered, Thank you. For tonight? For this. I nodded, my heart full, my voice steady as I replied, Thank you too. It meant more than I can say. As I rose to leave, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that settled over me like a warm embrace. I knew that this night, this moment, would stay with me, woven into the fabric of who I was, a memory of a time when I'd felt truly seen, truly understood. As I made my way out of the house, my mind lingered on everything we'd shared that evening. The night air was cool, but the warmth of our connection seemed to follow me, wrapping around me like a quiet assurance. The drive home felt surreal, as though I were moving through a dream, each street light casting shadows that flickered like memories. For days afterward, our conversation replayed in my mind. I found myself reflecting on his words, the way he'd looked at me, the gentle way he'd held my hand. The feeling was difficult to describe, but it was something deeper than mere attraction. It was as though I'd rediscovered a part of myself in his presence. I knew that night was just a single evening, a brief moment in time, but it felt as though it had left a lasting mark on me, one I couldn't easily shake. And yet, I also found myself hesitant to reach out, unsure if doing so would change the simplicity of what we'd shared. It was a delicate balance, the kind of connection that felt too precious to disturb, too rare to force into something more. So I kept the memory close, a quiet reminder that sometimes the most meaningful connections come when we least expect it. But a week later, a message appeared on my phone, his name lighting up the screen. My heart leapt, a rush of emotions filling me as I opened the message. Hi, I hope you've been well. I haven't been able to stop thinking about our conversation the other night. If you're free, would you like to meet up for coffee sometime? A smile tugged at my lips as I read his words. There was a warmth, a sincerity in his message that reminded me of the quiet joy I'd felt in his presence. I replied almost immediately, my fingers tapping out a simple, honest response. I'd love that. Let me know when works for you. We arranged to meet that weekend at a small cafe downtown, a cozy, tucked away spot that felt perfect for an afternoon of quiet conversation. The anticipation of seeing him again filled me with a mixture of excitement and nervousness, a feeling I hadn't felt in years. The day arrived, and I found myself arriving at the cafe a few minutes early, scanning the room as I settled into a corner booth. The soft hum of conversation filled the air, and I sipped my coffee, glancing out the window as I waited. And then he was there, stepping through the door, his gaze finding mine almost instantly. A gentle smile spread across his face, and I felt like coming home. "Hi," he said, his voice low, a softness in his eyes that made my heart flutter. "Hi," I replied, mirroring his smile. We settled into an easy rhythm, the conversation picking up as if no time had passed since our last meeting. There was a comfort in being with him, a feeling that I could be myself without pretense or reservation. As we talked, I noticed the small, thoughtful details that I'd come to associate with him, the way he would pause before responding, his careful choice of words, the way his gaze would soften when he spoke about something close to his heart. He asked about my week, listened intently as I shared stories from work, and shared bits and pieces of his own life, his words filled with a quiet wisdom that I found both grounding and inspiring. At one point, our conversation took a more personal turn, touching on dreams and regrets, the choices that had shaped us. His gaze grew more introspective, and I felt a shift, a quiet intensity settling between us. "Do you ever wonder how different life could have been if you'd made different choices?" he asked softly. He asked, searching mine, as if looking for an answer he'd been carrying for a long time. All the time," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. "But I think maybe every choice leads us to moments like this, moments that remind us of who we are, of what really matters." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Maybe that's true. Maybe we're always exactly where we're meant to be, even if it doesn't feel that way at the time." Our words lingered, hanging in the air like an unspoken truth, and I felt a familiar warmth spread through me, a sense of connection that went beyond words. It was as if we were both acknowledging something deeper, something that we couldn't quite put into words, but both understood instinctively. As the afternoon wore on, we talked about everything and nothing, our conversation flowing seamlessly, each topic weaving into the next. I found myself laughing, smiling, feeling a lightness I hadn't felt in a long time. It was as though being with him brought out a part of me I'd forgotten, a part that felt alive, real, unguarded. When it was time to leave, he walked me to my car, his hand resting on my shoulder as we said our goodbyes. There was a warmth in his touch, a gentle reassurance that lingered as I got into the car, watching him through the window as he waved and turned to leave. Over the following weeks, we met up a few more times, each meeting filled with the same quiet joy, the same sense of connection. Our conversations grew deeper, more personal, and with each passing day, I found myself looking forward to our time together, savoring each moment as it came. One evening, he invited me over to his place for dinner, a small gathering with a few friends. The evening was filled with laughter and stories, a warm, inviting atmosphere that felt like family. As the night wound down and the others began to leave, He caught my eye, a soft smile playing on his lips. "Stay for a bit?" he asked, his voice quiet, a hint of vulnerability in his gaze. I nodded, feeling a familiar thrill as the last of the guests left, leaving just the two of us in the cozy warmth of his living room. We settled onto the couch, our conversation picking up where it had left off, each word weaving us closer together, drawing us into a shared world that felt both safe and exhilarating. At some point, the conversation slowed and we fell into a comfortable silence, the kind that felt natural, unforced. He looked over at me, his gaze soft but intense, and I felt my heart quicken, a quiet anticipation building between us. "Can I tell you something?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Mm." I nodded, my breath catching as I waited, sensing that this moment would change everything. "I didn't expect to feel this way," he said, his words filled with honesty and warmth. "But being with you, it feels right. It feels like something I didn't even know I was missing." His words hit me deeply, resonating with a truth I hadn't fully acknowledged. I felt my own emotions rise to the surface, a mixture of joy, vulnerability, and a sense of belonging that I hadn't felt in a long time. "I feel the same," I replied, my voice trembling slightly. "I don't know where this will lead, but I'm glad we found each other." He reached for my hand, his fingers lacing with mine, a simple gesture that held a world of meaning. We sat like that, our hands intertwined, the silence between us filled with unspoken words, unacknowledged feelings that neither of us had dared to voice until now. Slowly, he lifted his other hand, gently brushing a stray strand of hair from my face, his touch soft and lingering. Our gazes met, and in that moment, everything else faded away. The room, the world, all the uncertainties. All that remained was the warmth of his hand, the depth of his gaze, the quiet promise that neither of us needed to speak aloud. The world seemed to hold its breath as he leaned closer, his eyes searching mine for permission, a question unspoken, yet understood. I felt my heart race, a mixture of excitement and calm washing over me, and I knew that this was a moment I would carry with me, no matter where life took us. Our lips met in a soft, gentle kiss, a quiet expression of everything we felt but hadn't put into words. It was a kiss that held all the things we'd shared, all the moments that had brought us to this point. A kiss that was both tender and filled with a quiet intensity. We stayed like that, wrapped in each other's embrace, letting the warmth of our connection fill the spaces that had once felt empty, knowing that this moment would be something we would both cherish. As we pulled back, our gazes held, filled with a sense of understanding, of gratitude for the journey that had brought us here. With a quiet smile, he whispered, "Thank you for everything." I nodded, my heart full, my voice soft as I replied, "Thank you, too." In the quiet that followed, we stayed close, our hands still entwined, the world outside feeling distant and somehow less real. There was a sense of peace in that moment, a stillness that wrapped around us like a blanket, and I found myself savoring every detail. The warmth of his hand, the gentle weight of his gaze, the feeling of being truly seen and understood. As time passed, we began talking again, our words soft and unhurried, drifting between reflections and quiet laughter, as though we were sharing a secret world known only to us. Every now and then, our gazes would meet, and in those moments, no words were necessary. It was as if we both understood the depth of what was unfolding between us, a connection that was undeniable, yet felt as natural as breathing. "Take care," he whispered, his voice warm, his eyes filled with an emotion that made my heart ache in the best possible way. You too, I replied, my voice barely above a whisper, a soft smile on my lips. I'll see you soon. He nodded, a quiet understanding passing between us as I stepped out into the cool night air. As I walked to my car, I felt a sense of contentment, a feeling that I hadn't known I'd been missing until now. It was as though I had rediscovered a part of myself, a part that had been waiting for this very connection, this very night. The drive home felt like a dream, and for days afterward, I carried the memory of our time together like a precious gift, replaying our conversations, the warmth of his touch, the way he'd looked at me with such quiet understanding. I knew that our connection was something rare, something that didn't happen often, and I felt grateful for every moment we'd shared. We continued to see each other in the weeks that followed, our meetings growing more frequent, each one filled with the same warmth and ease that had defined our first night together. We fell into a rhythm, a quiet, unspoken bond that felt both exhilarating and deeply comforting. It was a relationship that existed outside of definitions, a connection that didn't require labels or expectations. It was simply real, and that was enough. Every time we met, I felt that same quiet thrill, that sense of belonging that came from being with someone who truly understood me. Our conversations ranged from the profound to the playful, each one weaving us closer together, building a foundation of trust and affection that felt as steady as the earth itself. And then, one evening, as we sat together in his living room, a new depth began to take shape between us. The day had been filled with laughter and easy conversation, and as the night wore on, we found ourselves talking about our lives in a way that felt deeper, more vulnerable. He shared stories from his past, moments that had shaped him, and I felt honored to be let into his world, to hear the stories that had defined him. There was a moment of silence as he finished speaking, a comfortable pause that allowed his words to settle, and I felt a quiet urge to share something of my own. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the memories I was about to reveal. You know, I began, my voice soft. There was a time in my life when I thought I had everything figured out. I thought I knew exactly who I was, where I was going. But then, life had other plans. He nodded, his gaze gentle, encouraging me to continue. I went through a difficult time, one that made me question everything. I lost parts of myself along the way, parts that I wasn't sure I'd ever find again. But being here with you, it's like I'm rediscovering those pieces. Like I'm finally remembering who I am. He reached out, his hand finding mine, his touch warm and reassuring. I know that feeling, he murmured, his voice filled with a quiet empathy. Sometimes it takes someone else to remind us of the parts of ourselves that we've forgotten. Our eyes met, and in that moment I felt a surge of gratitude, a feeling of being exactly where I was meant to be. It was as if he had seen straight into my soul, recognizing the parts of myself that I had long since buried. And with his presence, he had brought them back to life. As the evening continued, our conversation drifted into a comfortable silence, and I felt a sense of peace settle over me. I looked around his living room, the soft glow of the lamp casting a warm light over the room, and I felt as though I were home, not just in this place, but in his presence, and the quiet, steady strength of our connection. Eventually, as the night grew late, I knew it was time to go, but the thought of leaving felt more difficult than usual. I hesitated, my hand lingering in his, and he seemed to sense my reluctance, his gaze holding mine with a gentle understanding. "Stay a little longer?" he asked, his voice quiet, filled with a warmth that made my heart ache with a mixture of joy and anticipation. I nodded, a soft smile on my lips as I settled back onto the couch, feeling a sense of calm wash over me. We sat together in silence, our hands entwined, the room filled with a quiet contentment that felt like a gentle embrace. It was a moment that didn't need words, a moment that didn't need building quietly, steadily, over the past few weeks. As the hours passed, I felt myself drifting, my head resting against his shoulder, a sense of peace enveloping me. It was as if all the uncertainties, all the doubts had faded away, leaving only the warmth of his presence, the quiet strength of his embrace. And in that stillness, I felt a quiet realization settle over me, a realization that this connection, this bond, was something I wanted to nurture, to cherish for as long as life would allow. It was a connection that had brought me back to myself, that had reminded me of the beauty of human connection, the power of being truly seen. Eventually, as the first light of dawn began to filter through the window, we knew it was time to part, but there was a quiet understanding between us, a promise that this was only the beginning. He walked me to the door, his hand lingering in mine, his eyes holding mine with a quiet joy. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with a quiet emotion that mirrored my own. "Thank you," I replied, my heart full as I looked into his eyes, feeling a deep sense of gratitude for everything we had shared, everything that lay ahead. As I stepped out into the cool morning air, I felt a sense of peace, a quiet contentment that stayed with me, wrapping around me like a gentle embrace. I knew that this connection, this bond, was something rare, something precious, and I felt grateful for every moment we had shared, every quiet conversation, every gentle touch. And as I walked into the light of a new day, I carried with me the memory of his warmth, the feeling of being truly seen, truly understood. It was a memory that I knew would stay with me, a reminder of a time when life had given me an unexpected gift, a gift of connection, of understanding, of love.